thanks, Leslie. I was thinking maybe 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because I know a lot of people haven't started to practice yet.
Well, because they.
Is that how it does it do?
Probably not. Why is it?
I just did one
Oh, I know.
with the senior judge, and I didn't know whether I should stop him because I didn't think about it.
So then this one. Sorry.
Well, this one we didn't have there was a statement from the family by the
Yeah, I mean, it's.
but
Allocution is before.
I mean, I didn't even think about having that, like, it was a season judge, and I was like, do I stop him? Like, doing this wrong? Like, I don't know, like, no, like,
You should have an eraser for those.
you know,
Unless they're making a mistake.
Alan, do you have a rough time left? You think an hour, hour and a half? $121. Okay.
Thank you. Good morning. Please be seated. Okay, we are back in open court for day 2 of sentencing hearing. State of Iowa versus Jeremy Everett Goodale, Jefferson County case FECR 005144. Dr. Cunningham was testifying when we broke yesterday, and Dr. Cunningham, you may come up and we've got the mic on for you, so once you are seated and comfortable, we'll let Mr. Cook proceed with his questioning.
With that now. Dr. Cunningham, what is the next psychosocial adversity impacting Germany's functional maturity?
The next factor was social divisions in school and community.
Which of your findings addresses this psychosocial adversity?
This is finding 4. Jeremy Goodale's functional maturity was adversely impacted by social divisions in both his school and community experience.
Does your discussion of this factor begin on page 41 of your report?
It does.
Please briefly describe this finding and how it relates to Jeremy's functional maturity.
Certainly. So a primary task of adolescence is identifying with the community around you, with valuing people who are not your blood kin. One of the ways that you do that is by identifying with and feeling a part of that community. As there are divisions in that, then that undermines that identification with the community as a whole. And so then makes you more vulnerable to act out against those members of the community that you're not experiencing as like part of the folks that you belong to. In Jeremy's school experience, as he attended the Maharishi School, there was some social division between those that were fully private paying in their tuition and those like the Goodale children that were receiving scholarships, where there was a sense of discrepancy in the way that they were treated or even who would play with them after school. Then there are also divisions in the community between the regular community kids and the Rue kids, or the kids that were going to the Maharishi School, and some division larger in the community between those that followed the Maharishi movement and those that did not. As Jeremy is kind of incompletely identified with the Maharishi group, it created an additional challenge in identifying and experiencing a reciprocal sense of social obligation to folks that were more broadly placed in the community. This was aggravated by many of his father's stances about never being pleased with any of Jeremy's school experiences, or those administrators, whether at the Maharishi School or in the public schools, being broadly against many general societal experiences or expectations. He was anti-vax, anti-woke, anti-all kinds of things. Now, as he expresses those opinions, part of what he's doing is identifying that the larger community is not something that you identify with. It's alien and even malevolent. Now, that's an unintentional effect in terms of its impact on Jeremy's social identification and development of kind of community morality, but it has impact nonetheless. And so those social divisions that he's experiencing himself between the Maharishi movement and the community at large are aggravated by a much broader sense of alienation that Dean experiences and is very vocal about with the larger community.
Dr. Cunningham, in addition to neurodevelopmental deficits and psychosocial adversities, what was the next arena of maturity delaying factors in Jeremy's childhood that exacerbated the brain immaturity shared by all 16-year-olds?
That was psychological disorders.
Which of your findings addresses this psychological disorder arena?
This is finding 5. Jeremy Goodale suffered from a mood disorder from his pre-adolescence, additionally challenging the progression of functional maturity.
And to assist the court, does your discussion of this finding begin on page 42 of your report?
It does.
Dr. Cunningham, what symptoms of a mood disorder did Jeremy exhibit from his preteens to the weeks and months preceding this offense?
So from his very early adolescence up through the weeks and months preceding this offense, Jeremy suffered from a mood disorder. And consistent with the cyclic nature that mood disorders have, he experienced a cycle of symptoms. Typically, these symptoms would last a month. The cycle might be as rapid as being depressed for a month and then feeling better for a couple of weeks and then being depressed again, or it might be some months in between those cycles. During those times that he was in this depressive phase of the cycle, his mood was depressed, he experienced feelings of futility, he was irritable and was easily frustrated, a very common adolescent expression of mood disorder. He suffered a loss of motivation and interest, except maybe for video games and smoking weed and kind of walking around town with just a few friends. He was easily fatigued. He was interpersonally withdrawn, except for just a few interactions. There were very intense feelings of self-blame and self-recrimination, feelings of worthlessness and failure, periodically accompanied, as I testified yesterday, by meltdowns of self-recriminations. You're so stupid, you're so worthless, nobody likes you, those kinds of things. He experienced social anxiety of in a social situation, believing that he had said something stupid that other people were reacting negatively to, then the kind of self-recriminations, that was so stupid, why do you say that, folks know you're a nerd, this kind of self-recrimination in a social context that inhibited his interactions there. He was also experiencing a sleep disturbance, another vegetative sign of a mood disorder. His escape was into video games and also increasing his marijuana use as kind of a self-medication to relieve his social anxiety and the broader experience of depression. He had passive thoughts of suicide. That means that kind of thoughts of, I wish I wasn't here. It would be better to be dead, that sort of thing. And then, as I described, he'd have these periodic meltdowns, anywhere from every few weeks to every few months, of these bawling spells that would last for 2 or 3 hours while he's got himself locked in his bedroom or his room with his sobbing and self-recriminations and very intense feelings of futility and worthlessness.
Dr. Cunningham, how does the presence of a mood disorder affect the risk of violent crime among adolescents?
It's a significant risk factor for violent crime. There's a very large-scale study, almost 60,000 young people. There were 3 longitudinal cohorts. In other words, there were 3 groups that were followed over time across their adolescence and into early adulthood. And as good research does, they then controlled for the influence of other factors. So they controlled for parental criminality, which would be a risk factor for teen violence. They controlled for child maltreatment, things like abuse and neglect. They also controlled for conduct disorder, which is a more severe and chronic kind of childhood misbehavior syndrome. So they controlled for those other factors that might be associated with teen violent crime so that you could distill out just the effect of what mood disorder was causing. And using a regression analysis, which is a way of controlling for those other factors, they identified that there was between a 1.7 and 2.1 greater incidence of violent crime among adolescents and young adults with a depression diagnosis. Now, they didn't all, of course, be violent, but you've got this increased incidence that's significant. And among those whose depression was bad enough that they were put in the hospital, there was an almost 3 times greater incidence of violent crime among those young people.
Dr. Cunningham, what's the next arena of maturity delaying factors in Jeremy's childhood that exacerbated the brain immaturity shared by all 16-year-olds?
So the next factor is substance dependence.
Which of your findings addresses this maturity-related, maturity undermining factor?
This is finding 7. Jeremy Goodale's functional maturity was further delayed by marijuana dependence and other substance abuse from his early teens.
Does your discussion of this finding begin on page 47 of your report?
It does.
Dr. Cunningham, before you describe Jeremy's teen alcohol and drug abuse, what are the risk factors for alcohol and drug abuse?
So the risk factors for, the primary risk factors are 5. The strongest of these is genetic predisposition. In other words, that there is a family history of substance abuse and or mood disorder in your family system. If you have a first-degree relative, that means mother, father, brother, sister, who is alcohol or drug abusing, then you're 3 to 5 times more likely to end up being drug abusing as well, or substance abusing of some sort. And of course, I displayed in Jeremy's family tree that family system is replete with histories of alcohol and drug abuse, as well as mood disorder. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is another risk factor for substance dependence. That's also present in Jeremy's history. Mood disorder is a risk factor for substance dependence. That also is present in Jeremy. Modeling of substance abuse and dependence was occurring both among his peers and also among his siblings. And then he was aware that his father was buying weed from the same person that Jeremy was buying weed from. And then finally, developmental trauma or instability. Those are experiences that would create internal emotional pain that a teenager or an adult would seek to medicate by using substances. And Jeremy spoke of the relief that he got from his anxieties and depression by smoking weed.
Dr. Cunningham, of the factors listed here, which is the most powerful, if any, in terms of who ends up with an alcohol or drug problem?
The genetic predisposition.
Which of these factors for alcohol and drug abuse were present in Jeremy's background?
All of them.
Dr. Cunningham, can you please detail for us what you learned about Jeremy's drug and alcohol use from his early teens?
I can. So he started out in 7th grade smoking marijuana on the weekends, on Saturday and Sunday of each weekend with a peer. In 8th grade, that escalated to smoking marijuana daily after school and all day on weekends with peers. Then in 9th grade, again with peers, he was smoking marijuana before school, at lunch, after school, and on weekends. And then in 10th and 11th grade, he continued to smoke marijuana daily. He used mushrooms or acid twice a month with Chaden. And then he was binge drinking twice monthly at parties with other teenagers. Other times he would binge drink by himself.
What are the implications of routine drug abuse and episodic heavy drinking in teen years?
So there are a couple of primary impacts that are negative. One of them is that substance abuse is altering and interfering with this rapid growth in the brain systems that are developing across your teenage years. And so as someone is abusing substances, that's interfering with that process and even resulting in some malformations as a result of it. So there is a physiological developmental component to heavy substance use during the teens. Additionally, the discomforts and struggles that all of us recall about our teens, those experiences were in fact developing emotional muscles that we would use to cope with stresses both at that time and later in life. As this young person is anesthetizing himself, it's not unlike what happens if you put your arm in a cast. You take the cast off after a couple of months and those muscles have atrophied. And that's part of what happens with substance dependence during the teenage years is those emotional muscles are not developing. This is recognized in the recovery recovery systems and treatment. In AA, those AA meetings and step studies are not about just helping this person remain sober, not drink, but instead are intended to help them develop the emotional muscles and progress in their own internal maturity in ways that have been arrested by that substance dependence. So in AA, someone may talk about being 40 going on 14. That means they're actually 40 years old, but they started drinking and drugging at 14 and kind of arrested developmentally at that point. And so now they're working on developing those systems. So even apart from acute intoxication, we're concerned about somebody that has an ongoing pattern of substance dependence because of that atrophying effect that it has. So when I get ready to fly back to Dallas this evening, I'm not just concerned that my pilot is not under the influence as he steps into the cockpit. I'm not happy if he's substance dependent, even if he happens to not have anything in his system this evening, because of that effect that substance dependence has broadly on judgment and reactions and attitudes and all kinds of things.
Dr. Cunningham, I noticed we previously skipped one of the psychosocial adversities impacting Jeremy's functional maturity. Do you know which one that one is?
Yes, I do. We delayed talking about the effects of the pandemic.
Why did you separate the discussion of the pandemic from the other psychosocial adversities?
Because the effect of the pandemic was to exacerbate Jeremy's mood disorder and also his substance dependence. And so before we talk about the pandemic, it's necessary to talk about those two sets of symptoms and disorders that ended up being aggravated.
Dr. Cunningham, which of your findings addresses Jeremy's experience of the COVID-19 pandemic?
This is finding 6. The social isolation of the pandemic exacerbated the family dysfunctions, disrupted Jeremy's adolescent development, and destabilized him.
Are your findings on, is your discussion on this finding, does that begin on page 43 of your report?
It does.
Dr. Cunningham, you've prepared a flow chart to aid in your testimony about how the pandemic impacted Jeremy in exacerbating other vulnerabilities, dysfunctions, and disorders. Is that correct?
I did.
Can you please use that chart to explain this impact?
Certainly. So before the pandemic, there are a number of vulnerabilities that are interacting with each other in Jeremy. He has ADHD. He is socially isolated as he grows up out on the farm, and then is also experiencing the social divisions within the school and community as well as his father's attitudes. And then he's also experiencing the deprivations within the family system, all of those factors that I testified about yesterday. Those are synergistically interacting with each other. Those are exacerbating each other and end up producing both a mood disorder and also his marijuana dependence. So that's where we are before the pandemic happens. Then and of course the hereditary predispositions are contributing to both the mood disorder and his marijuana dependence, as well as other risk factors that I described. Then the pandemic occurs. Now, as that happens, there is a loss of social interaction that he would otherwise have at school with peers, and also a loss of structure. Now, because he has ADHD, he is particularly in need of the structure of a classroom and other students around him that are doing his work, and the teacher who's right there to make sure that he stays on task. Those are all additional supports that he is particularly in need of because of the ADHD vulnerability. So we've taken away the social interactions and the structure that's there. Of course, that aggravates the expression of those ADHD symptoms because he's not able to structure himself, simply doesn't have that capacity. So now as he is not doing his work, and as he's home all the time, then he has the family dysfunctions increase because Dean's reactions to him about that inability to structure himself are increasingly negative and punitive, with lectures, with guilt-inducing statements to him of, after all that I'm doing here, you can't at least do this. Or as Jeremy is unable to do that, then Dean experiences that as a personal betrayal of him, that Jeremy has had this contract to behave in a certain way, which of course he can't do at that age and with the ADHD, that then is identified as his having been dishonest or betraying Dean and his expectations. So the family dysfunction and tensions are increased. And that leads to an exacerbation of both the mood disorder and his marijuana dependence. Really pushes him off track developmentally.
Dr. Cunningham, did you consider how Jeremy's immaturity may have been evident in his adaptive skill status?
I did. So Jeremy's immature status is quite evident if you simply look at the status of his life at the time of this offense, and that's my 8th finding.
Does your discussion of Jeremy's adaptive status begin on page 51 of your report?
It does.
Dr. Cunningham, without providing all the information detailed in your report, please illustrate Jeremy's immature adaptive status at the time of this offense.
So he's in his junior year in high school. He doesn't even brush his teeth every day, and he never flosses. He's never cooked a meal. He would recycle dirty clothes from his hamper. In doing his laundry, he never separated the colors and whites and would leave the damp clothes in the washer with some regularity where they would then mildew. He didn't fold his clothes, he just stuffs them in the drawer. Consistent with his immature status, he has a 9 o'clock curfew on weekdays and a 10 or 11 o'clock curfew on weekends. He's unable to self-structure himself in doing the online school instruction. What money he makes by working part-time on school holidays with the same construction company his father works with, he immediately blows on impulse purchases or weed. He'd never lived independently, never wrote a check, never paid a bill, didn't have a driver's license or even a driving permit, and Dean intuitively recognized that Jeremy was not mature enough to drive, and in fact with the mood disorder was even at some risk of potentially using that capability to harm himself. His longest romantic relationship since age 13, he had a little sweetheart in 7th grade, I think, for 6 months that we saw each other at school, and sometimes he would go to her house. After that, he had never had a romantic relationship that lasted longer than a month. He'd never been in love, still a virgin. His social development in that aspect of his life was simply very immature.
Dr. Cunningham, what was your next finding regarding Jeremy?
Finding 9, the effect of neurodevelopmental deficits, family dysfunctions and deprivations, psychological disorder, substance dependence, and the challenges of the pandemic and community schisms as well, rendered Jeremy functionally less mature than a normally situated 16-year-old.
Is this finding discussed beginning on page 54 of your report?
It is.
Dr. Cunningham, please illustrate this conclusion with the chart that we've been working through.
So earlier I identified that there are 4 major types of adversity that may interfere with the development of functional maturity. All 4 of these are present in Jeremy's background, and they serve to render him particularly immature as compared to a normally situated 16-year-old.
Dr. Cunningham, have you prepared a chart with a more detailed summary of the factors supporting this conclusion regarding Jeremy's particular functional immaturity?
I did.
Can you please summarize that chart for us, please?
Certainly. So we begin with the brain immaturity that all 16-year-olds have. And now we have these maturity delaying developmental factors that are present in his background. There are 9 primary family dysfunctions and deprivations that I reviewed. Then he also has a neurodevelopmental impairment, the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are these social divisions. He has a mood disorder, There's a destabilizing effect of social isolation in the pandemic, and then he's marijuana dependent as well. And those result in particular functional immaturity in him, well beyond what we would expect to see in a normally situated 16-year-old.
Dr. Cunningham, what was your next finding regarding factors undermining Jeremy's decision-making?
That was finding 10, that Jeremy continued to abuse substances proximate to the offense and was under the influence during the offense. That further degraded his judgment and impulse control.
Do you detail Jeremy's substance abuse proximate to the offense beginning on page 55 of your report?
I do.
Dr. Cunningham, what did you learn about Jeremy's substance ingestion proximate to the offense?
So first, in the week prior, to get some sense of what his pattern was close to the offense, he reported that he was smoking an eighth of marijuana daily. The first thing in the morning, he would smoke either a THC vape or THC wax. Then he would get to school a little bit early and smoke marijuana with peers there. At lunch, he went to a peer's house and smoked marijuana there. After school, he smoked marijuana with another peer as they drove around. And then in the evenings, he was picked up by another peer, and they would drive around and smoke weed.
How about Jeremy's substance ingestion the day of the offense?
So he had run out of the THC wax that weekend. So his first marijuana of the day was while he is with Zoe there at the park just before this offense. And they smoked 1.5 grams over a 45-minute period just prior to the offense. So he subjectively identified that he was high at the time that this began. That night after moving the body, Chayden provided alcohol, and they each drank 5 cans of 9% alcohol hard seltzer. He knew the alcohol would put him to sleep, he described, and that's what he wanted after this offense. He wanted to be put to sleep and be anesthetized.
What is the implication of drug abuse close in time to the offense?
So these are acting to further degrade his general judgment and impulse control. He's already got these limitations that are built in. The effect of this is to further undermine that decision making. Now, it doesn't rob him of choice. It didn't deprive him of, on an absolute basis, of knowing that this conduct is wrong, but it did impact the quality of judgment and moral reasoning that he could bring to bear on this. The same quality that I would be concerned about in my airline pilot. If this is what his substance abuse is the week before he walks into the cockpit to fly me home.
Dr. Cunningham, what was your next finding?
The next finding was finding 11. The limitations of youth and Jeremy's particular functional immaturity are evident in his decision-making and behavior, both in the lead up to the charged conduct and the operationalizing of it.
Is this finding discussed beginning on page 57 of your report?
It is.
Dr. Cunningham, have you listed on a slide the various factors in Jeremy's decision-making and behavior that are consistent with his particular functional immaturity?
I did, and identified 11 categories of those.
Could you briefly illustrate each of these?
Certainly. So first, misguided loyalty. That Jeremy places his loyalty to a friend over the obviously more significant moral and social imperative of someone else's life. That emphasis on pure relationship above all else is a feature of adolescence and also reflects his inability to discern proportionality of what his obligations to other people are. There are poor boundaries and limited ego strength. I talked about this some yesterday. This is not his problem. This is Chayden's problem. And yet he takes this on as his own. And has limited ego strength in being able to say, no, I'm not going to do that when Chayden first floats the idea to him. Or in the 2 weeks in between, having the ego strength to say, you know, I said I would, but actually, I'm not going to do this. And so his ego strength is not sufficient to tolerate the loss of face that he might have as Chayden viewed him. Then number 3, outsourcing of planning. A feature of adolescent decision-making that happens that you see in their involvement in criminal activity is they don't understand the law of parties. The law of parties means if you're along when a criminal act is done and are essentially giving consent to it, then you're up to your ears in everything that happens. So if you go into the convenience store with 3 other kids and to rob this, and one of them has a gun, and that person with the gun shoots the clerk, you're in this up to your ears, just like the guy with the gun. Adolescents don't get that law of parties. A part of their giving each other permission to experiment with different identities is you let somebody else do their thing, and that has nothing to do with you, even if you're alone. So Jeremy expresses this with the outsourcing of planning. Since this is Chayden's agenda, then we'll leave it to Chayden to organize and decide how this is going to happen. This mostly belongs to him. Yeah, I'm along, but I'm not really in it to the extent that he is. That's it. And so by so doing, he's expressing that failure to recognize the gravity of his own participation, as well as the gravity of the blowback from this. Not only the impact on the families involved and the taking of Ms. Graber's life, but the profound cost that this has every potential of causing in his own life. Then number 4, the synergy of immature persons, consistent with youthful offending. This is done jointly with another young person. In fact, though, it's not necessary for another person to have been involved. Chayden could have affected this by himself without Jeremy's participation. But instead, 2 young people will join together to do something that likely neither one of them would have done by themselves, even though it could be done independently. Now, the significance of acting independently, if one can, is that as you participate in a joint offense, you have made a lifelong potential witness of your co-defendant, who at any point in time in the future, by making a report of this to law enforcement to get himself out of some difficulty, then brings your life down too. And so generally, you want to take care in involving people beyond who is necessary to actually effect a crime, because you're creating witnesses against you and co-defendants. There's also this joint degradation in judgment and impulse control that happens as somebody else joins in. This idea I spoke of yesterday, that 1 boy is a boy, 2 boys are half a boy, and 3 boys are no boy at all. Number 5, consistent with the difficulty that teenagers have in maintaining perspective about being cut from an athletic team, about a romantic breakup, about failing a class. Teenagers are notorious for not being able to maintain perspective about a problem. That sometimes leads to suicide, as they regard that their life is over because some transient disappointment has happened. That's part of what Dean was concerned with in Jeremy. And so this failing Spanish is a transient issue. And in response to that transient issue that everybody's life will go forward from, likely without much of a ripple in the long run, there is a catastrophic solution that is applied. That lack of proportionality about problem and solution is classically adolescent. There is impulsivity in this offense. That's the judgment impulsiveness that I spoke of yesterday, in terms of the ways in which, although it's planned badly and only up to the point of affecting the murder. There's rigidity and limited ability to generate alternatives about bailing out of this plan once it has been put in motion, once he's agreed to it. There's profound neglect of the risk of apprehension. That occurs as Chaden tries to recruit Dill before he approaches Jeremy, in Jeremy speaking to Zoe about, would you still care about me if I killed somebody in advance of this, in having Zoe there at the crime scene where she can tie you and Chaden together just before Ms. Graber is seen for the last time. In the reports that they're each making to peers about their participation in this. Jeremy pushes a wheelbarrow across town in the middle of the night, where if he's observed, somebody is going to clearly have a memorable recollection of that. So just all kinds of ways that they are maximizing the likelihood that they're going to be caught. And in fact, that's exactly what occurs. Within 12 or 16 hours, they're both in custody, which is a remarkably rapid resolution of a criminal investigation. There is lots of improvisation that occurs. Because it hasn't been pre-planned after the murder, now they're having to make it up as they go. One of the remarkable instances of that is that when they take Ms. Graber's van and they leave it park it in the trees at the end of a dead end, they walk out just a short distance, and then they decide, actually, why don't we call somebody to pick us up? So Jeremy calls Habib to come pick them up. Now we've brought Habib into this. That when the car is discovered, there's someone who knows that you were in proximity to that vehicle on the basis of kind of a lane story. That's an example of the improvisation that's occurring as they go. Even that they neglected to consider that the ground would be too hard, would be very hard and difficult to dig into. There are many instances of adolescent limited theory of mind. I referenced theory of mind yesterday. Theory of mind is the ability to anticipate what other people are feeling, how they will react to something, what their agenda is, even if they haven't expressed it overtly. There are two broad areas where Jeremy exhibits limited theory of mind. And theory of mind is something that develops progressively with brain development across adolescence and into adulthood. A couple of major arenas that he's lacking in that. One of them is that Jeremy has an adequate theory of mind about Chaden, about Chaden's agendas, about why Chaden is putting him into this, is involving him at all, or is putting him in the lead in things like bringing the tarp and the wheelbarrow across town, and seems oblivious that Chaden may be taking advantage of him or even setting him up to be blamed for this offense. The other area that you see as deficits in theory of mind is that he seems entirely oblivious to how his reporting this will impact other people. So as he tells John Burnett about this, as he tells his video game buddies, he seems oblivious to the horror that they will have at the thought of somebody having been murdered and knowing who did that. And that they will not just keep this a secret. That by their own adolescence, they're going to need to tell somebody, a peer, a parent, someone, or may feel compelled to come and inform law enforcement. And so there's a broad and recurrent failure to recognize how other people are going to put things together. That it will occur to Dill, gee, Chaden tried to recruit me, I should probably tell somebody about that. Or Zoe, my goodness, Jeremy referenced killing somebody and now we've got a teacher who's dead. That he wouldn't have anticipated what would seem to be pretty obvious, that this is implicating him. This is going to land on people. They will remember this. And then finding 11, that limited theory of mind is exemplified by his discussing the offense immediately with many peers. And that's also a feature of adolescence, that they experience themselves by bouncing their identity and their experiences off of other young people. And as they try to sound that out and get a sense of themselves by what they say. And so there's this compulsive need to tell, and he's exhibiting that as well.
Dr. Cunningham, are you aware of a comment Jeremy made to his sister Jackie 48 hours following this offense?
I am.
And I believe that's been referenced a couple of times here in our hearing over the last couple of days, and I believe it's been paraphrased. In referencing the transcript, I'd like to detail this exchange for you to see if it's consistent with your recollection. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Jacqueline asks or states, or maybe, are you sure you are just not in so much shock? That's why you're not freaking out, because you're in so much shock. Jeremy's reaction, I honestly don't know. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel remorseful. I don't, and then he trails off. Is that your recollection?
It is.
What, if any, immaturity is reflected in this comment?
First, Jeremy's insight about himself and his own reactions is limited, and was particularly limited at age 16. And so as he says, I'm not in shock, or I don't know if I'm in shock, we wouldn't take that as dispositive about anything. I don't expect Jeremy to know much about what his inner state is at that point. Even today, Jeremy can't explain why he was compulsively telling other people about this in the immediate other young people in the immediate aftermath of this. So his insight about his reactions is very limited. That's number one. Number two, there's a good likelihood that he is in shock. That this is a completely aberrant and catastrophic behavior as compared to anything that he's ever been involved in, and would be exceedingly difficult to process. And so I don't know how Jeremy is not in shock at this point, given what he has to try to integrate and make sense of. Number three, it isn't just that somebody is particularly functionally immature as they commit the offense, but 48 hours later in police custody, now it's like they're a 30-year-old. Now they suddenly have all these capabilities. No, he is still this particularly functionally immature 16-year-old going on something less as he is sitting there with Jackie. And a part of the limitations of that youthfulness is not fully appreciating the magnitude of what he's done and the implications this is going to have for his life and the reverberating effects in the community and the profound loss to Ms. Graber of her life. And so because he's 16, he doesn't get that. And we really wouldn't expect him to at that moment. Those are the things that we would expect to develop as he crosses, as he reflects on this, as his brain matures, as he progresses from 16 to 18 to 20 to 25, the magnitude and the full implications of this will be something that descend on him and will continue to do so over a decade following this experience. And so this does not indicate somebody who is irreparably corrupt and incapable of those reactions. Those are part and parcel of what's happening in the moment with the apparatus that he has at the time.
Dr. Cunningham, how did Jeremy's particular functional immaturity impact his moral awareness and reasoning about the offense?
Well, it did not keep him from knowing on an absolute basis that this is wrong. But clearly that functional immaturity was having profound effect on these moral considerations that are a part of moral reasoning. And so it reduced those capabilities. At 16, they're incomplete anyway, and they're going to be further reduced by his functional immaturity because of the factors I've identified. So he's going to have a reduced capacity to engage in this sort of moral calculus.
Doctor, let me return to a concept that you discussed earlier. Would every 16-year-old with adversities like Jeremy engage in serious criminal violence?
No, you're going to expect someone from Jeremy's background to have a difficult teen progression. Their adolescence is going to be troubled. You've grown up, you have these hereditary predispositions. There's this very serious deprivation in your childhood. Your mom leaves you when you're 10 years old. Your parents are limited. This is somebody who's going to have some significant difficulties as a teenager. Exactly what form that takes is uncertain. His potential for this being reflected in criminality and criminal violence is much increased. But similar to our 100% penetration discussion, you wouldn't expect to see this in everybody. You'd expect them to be growing out tumors of some sort. Everybody's not going to express this in a violent way.
Dr. Cunningham, did Jeremy's particular immaturity make him commit this offense?
No, it didn't make him commit it. He still had a choice, but he had a choice that was inclined by his immaturity and the adversities that I've described.
What are the implications of your findings in this regard?
So very importantly is to recognize that as we look at that immaturity and adverse factors, that's the only apparatus that Jeremy has to use in decision making. It's not like we've got this particularly immature brain here, and then there's this little man in his head, what psychologists call a homunculus. But there's this little man in his head that somehow sits outside of all of that and decides what the right thing to do is, or what the best thing to do is. There's no part of him that sits outside the apparatus that he has. There's only that limited impaired apparatus. So no little homunculus that's making these decisions. And that's an important concept to understand, that people are only able to use what they have. There isn't magically some other part that sits outside of that that's making the decisions.
Do you have an analogy that illustrates how choice is inclined by immaturity and adversity?
I probably do, but I can't think of it in the moment.
I think we talked about teen speeding on wet pavement analogy.
Sure. So let's say that you've got a teenager who is driving recklessly on wet pavement. Now that teenager is clearly making a choice about doing that. He knows he's driving a car. He knows the pavement is wet. He knows the traction isn't quite as good. He knows that he's speeding. There is at least an intellectual awareness that that could result in an accident. Now, he engages in that behavior anyway because he is limited in his ability to properly weigh that context. The severity of the accident that may occur and the injuries that may result to him or other people against the experience of speeding in the moment. So it's not that he doesn't have a choice, it's that he has a choice that is driven by this primacy of reward over risk, driven by a faulty risk calculus. If there are other teenagers in the car with him, then even the presence of another teen, whether they're encouraging it or not, just the presence of that individual further degrades the quality of choice. So that's what results in those fatalities, those driving fatalities, being so much higher for these younger kids or younger individuals. Not because they don't have a choice in the way they drive, but because they make defective choices out of impaired judgment that is part and parcel of their youthfulness and brain maturity.
Dr. Cunningham, of the factors specified by the Miller Court and adopted by the Iowa Supreme Court in the Lyle decision, which ones have your testimony addressed so far?
So my testimony has addressed A, the character and record of the individual offender and the circumstances of the offense. It's addressed B, the background and mental and emotional development of a youthful defendant. It's addressed C, the juvenile's chronological age and its hallmark features, among them immaturity, impetuosity, and failure to appreciate the risk and consequences. My testimony is addressed D, the family and home environment that surrounds the juvenile, no matter how brutal or dysfunctional. And E, the circumstances of the homicide offense, including the extent of his participation in the conduct and the way familial and peer pressure may have affected the juvenile.
Which factors remain?
The factors that I'm focused on next are the juvenile's potential for rehabilitation.
Dr. Cunningham, what's the rehabilitation factor? Well, was the rehabilitation factor the second focus for your evaluation?
It was. You'll remember there were 4 sentencing factors. I'm addressing 2 of those. And the second one I'm addressing is rehabilitation, or the potential for successful community reintegration.
And what is your next finding addressing Jeremy's rehabilitation?
So this is finding 12. Jeremy's pre-offense misconduct and offense participation had an adolescent onset. In other words, he wasn't a profoundly troubled kid in his behavior. Because of individuals that have adolescent onset misconduct have a better prognosis in terms of whether they engage in sustained criminality than the kids who have always been seriously behaviorally troubled from childhood and continue that into adolescence. That sustained trajectory puts them at greater risk. Because of maturational immaturity as a mid-teen at the time of the offense, even such serious teen misconduct is not predictive of the risk of offending after age 25 and cannot be assumed to demonstrate incorrigibility or irretrievable depravity.
Dr. Cunningham, is this finding discussed beginning on page 61 of your report?
It is.
What does research tell us about whether juvenile offenders continue to criminally offend into adulthood?
So the takeaway is that the vast majority of juvenile offenders, including those who commit serious crimes, grow out of antisocial activity as they transition into adulthood.
Can you please?
And this is part of what the Miller Court was describing about the character of a teenager is not yet solidified. And so you can't assume that the behaviors that they exhibit in their teens reflect some sort of fixed personality character structure in them. That character and personality structure is still under construction. And so as they obtain greater brain development, they no longer engage in this misconduct because it wasn't about their character, it was about their youthfulness.
Dr. Cunningham, can you please illustrate this research and tell us about its conclusions?
Sure. So one of the researchers that studied this is a psychologist by the name of Lawrence Steinberg. Steinberg has engaged in studies that were sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice. One of those looked at 1,300 juvenile offenders and then followed those 1,300 offenders from their adolescent offending out into adulthood, up to 7 years after their convictions. And what Steinberg observed from this group is that the process of maturing out of crime is linked to the process of maturing more generally, brain development more generally, including the development of impulse control. That means putting the brakes on things that are a bad idea, and future orientation, being able to track forward into the future about your own behavior and your own outcomes.
Dr. Cunningham, how do these findings from Steinberg fit with prior research on whether adolescent offending continues into adulthood?
I seem to have disconnected. I'm back. So they're entirely consistent with a friend of the court, an amnesty brief that the American Psychological Association filed with the Supreme Court in the Miller v. Alabama case. And those findings, from historical findings that the American Psychological Association described, only a small portion of adolescents who experiment with illegal activities will develop an entrenched pattern of criminal behavior that persists into adulthood. That holds even for youth who commit very serious crimes, or the most serious crimes. And remember that this friend of the court brief is being filed in Miller v. Alabama. This is a teenager who committed a murder. So that's who the American Psychological Association is talking about, is even these youth who've committed the most serious crimes. And that's what the Miller court is addressing as well, as they talk about that because character and personality is not yet fully formed, and because of the effect of brain immaturity, you can't simply use this criminal conduct as a teenager to conclude that this person is somehow irreparably corrupt.
Doctor, what factors account for why criminality and criminal violence do not continue into adulthood for these juvenile offenders?
So there are several processes that are happening with enhanced brain development that account for why adults are so much less likely to involve themselves in criminal activity than teenagers. The first feature is temperance. That's the ability to control impulses, including aggressive impulses. The second is perspective. That's the ability to consider other points of view, including taking into account longer-term repercussions and consequences, and also to take the vantage point of others, of how this will end up, how you'll view this at a point in the future, how your family will view this, how the victim's family will view it, the effect that it has on the victim, that you have a greater capacity to appreciate the repercussions of an act. And the third aspect is responsibility. That's the ability to take personal responsibility for one's behavior and resist the coercive influence of others.
Doctor, can you please explain how a more mature brain specifically reduces the potential for criminality and criminal violence into adulthood?
I can. So as we think about the components, to break down further the components of these themes that I identified from Steinberg. Adults, and by adults I mean people beyond age 25 who have gotten fully adult brain development. They have more effective impulse control, but have better brakes. They have a more realistic appraisal of apprehension. Remember, I talked about the issue in committing a crime is typically not committing it. It's pretty easy. It's getting away with it. And so there's a more realistic recognition of that potential. There's a recognition of the long-term consequences to your own personal outcomes. And of course, Jeremy's decision-making in this regard has been catastrophic regarding his own personal outcomes. That for maintaining and serving a friendship with Chaden and maintaining Chaden's positive regard, that he has sacrificed half of his adolescence and a good chunk of his adulthood. And so that ability to see the cost develops with your brain maturation. There's an identification and empathy with potential victims, which was obviously sadly lacking here. There's a clear identity as a law-abiding and moral individual, a sense of obligation that you have to family and others, an identification of the larger community that we're all in this together, and an appreciation of the collective good, and a mature commitment to a religious or ethical system. And of course, any functional religious or ethical system is going to discourage and prohibit you from behaving in ways that are exploitative and destructive to other people.
Dr. Cunningham, what's your next finding addressing Jeremy's rehabilitation?
My next finding is that his misconduct in the early years of custody, the disciplinary infractions that he's had in the juvenile facility, as well as the assault that he had on this inmate in the adult facility, that those behaviors are relatively typical of Miller defendants. That said, he exhibits early indications of rehabilitation.
Is your finding in this regard addressed beginning on page 63 of your report?
It is.
Dr. Cunningham, what factors point to early rehabilitation and Jeremy making gains in his maturity?
Well, the first factor that is consistent with these Miller defendants is that when Jeremy comes into custody, he is not somehow magically 27 years old. He's still 16 when he comes into custody and is particularly immature for 16. So we're going to expect to see demonstrations of that immaturity. And just as Miller defendants come into custody less than 18, they're going to have a number of years early in custody before they get out to 25 and beyond, where they're still immature, where their brain development is incomplete, and they are behaving in custody consistent with that. And so in his early confinement, consistent with that, Jeremy is involved in kind of a minor disrespect, minor noncompliance, very teenage-like in those displays. And then is vulnerable, as I described yesterday, to the influence and direction of an older inmate about how you go about addressing this problem of the guy who's celled in your area who won't take a bath and is being disrespectful and exposing himself. So first, important to have a sense of this is not at all unusual and doesn't have a long-term negative prognosis aspect to it. In terms of gains in his maturity that are evident, there is a declining frequency of disciplinary infractions. That even as he's moved from 16 to 18, there isn't the same frequency of kind of disrespect, oppositional kinds of things. He has expressed remorse regarding the offense. He took responsibility for it with a proffer that implicated himself beyond what was even necessary. So with his own words, Jeremy described striking Mrs. Graber with a bat, something that would not otherwise have been known, that he also had struck her, but for his saying that in his proffer. And this is a proffer that was regarded as candid by the law enforcement officers that were undertaking the investigation. And so there is evidence of a growth in responsibility as he describes this, even to his own detriment.
Doctor, are these behaviors that point to Jeremy's ongoing? Are there behaviors that also point to Jeremy's ongoing immaturity as well?
There are, and that's what I described in terms of his disrespect and noncompliance in juvenile custody, and this assault on another inmate, this fist assault that occurred in June of 2023.
And what is the significance of this assault for Jeremy's rehabilitation potential?
I think it has no enduring implications. As we think about parole recidivism in terms of who reoffends on parole, the focus is typically in the several years before release. Maybe if you're talking about more serious violence, in the 5 years before release. And so this is kind of like Jeremy had a serious reckless driving incident at age 16, and then he has a speeding ticket at age 18. What's the predictive significance that has for his driving at age 30? Well, not very much. Because of both brain maturity issues and because the best predictor at that point will be the preceding 3 to 5 years, not what happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Dr. Cunningham, what is your next finding addressing Jeremy's rehabilitation?
that by a number of metrics, Jeremy has a high likelihood of adjusting to the community without criminality or violence upon release as an adult.
Is this factor discussed beginning on page 66 of your report?
It is.
Dr. Cunningham, in addition to personal observations of Jeremy, are there research perspectives that can assist in illuminating his likelihood of adjusting someday to the open community without reoffending?
There are.
What are these base rates?
Well, so these factors, the most important being follow-up data of other adolescent murderers who then were released to the community after serving an initial term in prison. And also data regarding factors that are associated with a greater or lesser likelihood of offending on parole based on general parolees, not teenage offenders, but just general parolee data. Both of these make use of what we could call the insurance company method, which is defining a group and then tracking them over time. So for example, when my oldest son turned 16, the car insurance premiums went up $1,000 every 6 months. That was based on the insurance company's experience with 16-year-old male unmarried drivers. So on the basis of that historical experience, they then set a casualty rate because that's the most accurate way of forecasting what's going to happen or what your likely risk is. In medicine, that's called prognosis. So if I go to the doctor and he identifies that I have a cancer, one of my first questions is, what's the prognosis? What's the 5-year survival rate of people with this diagnosis at this stage? And that 5-year survival rate, that group data, is the best basis for identifying what my outcome will be. Same thing with the automobile insurance industry in terms of those 16-year-old male unmarried drivers. So if we can, we want to find group statistical data because that group statistical data is the best and most scientific basis for identifying what our potential outcomes are in this case. Now, that kind of group statistical data is the primary foundation of the mental health sciences, of psychology, and medicine as well. It's based on group data that follows people, that examines then what symptoms coalesce into what disorders, what treatments have what percentage of treatment outcome. All of that is based on group statistical data. The primary group statistical data is called the base rate. That's the 5-year survival with this stage of cancer. That's the outcomes of 16-year-old male unmarried drivers. Or if we're doing a risk assessment, what's the outcome of similarly described individuals? Now, knowledge of the base rate, knowing what that base rate is the single most important piece of information that you can have to do an accurate assessment of what may happen in the future. This was first articulated, first described in the scholarly literature by John Monahan, who's kind of the father of violence risk assessment in forensic psychology. He first described this in a very influential monograph in 1981. So for a long time, for over 40 years, the base rate has been a primary metric as we think about violence risk assessment. So we have base rates that we can look at, most importantly, regarding Miller releasees, because those are the offenders that are most like Jeremy Goodale. They committed a murder in their teens. They then serve a term in prison, then they're released to the community, then what happens to them? Those are the most accurate to him. We could look at general parolees, but we have to be careful about that data because those are all offenders that committed their crimes beyond this less than 18 period. They committed their crimes when their characters were more formed, when they had a more established adult life status. So we want to be careful about using the outcomes about those adult offenders to inform a teenage murderer. But they do provide group data, at least about what some of the factors are that may raise and lower the risk.
Dr. Cunningham, what is the scholarly consensus regarding the role of group data in assessing future risk of violence in the future?
Most important piece of information you can have to do a scientifically informed diagnosis, treatment, or violence risk assessment.
Well, let's turn to that most important piece, the Miller releases as it pertains to Mr. Goodale. Let's begin with research that has followed Miller releases. Please detail the first of these studies and what it revealed regarding the risk and comparative risk posed by these offenders.
Certainly. So as we talk about these Miller releases, the first study that I'll talk about is one that comes out of Philadelphia. This is a study that was performed by the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. And they followed 174 Miller juvenile lifers. In other words, these were 174 juvenile offenders who committed murder and were sentenced to life without parole. Then the Miller decision comes down from the Supreme Court saying you can't automatically sentence a juvenile murderer to life without parole. There needs to be a consideration of their youthfulness and circumstances of the offense and their character and background, these factors that I described addressing in my evaluation. So they then had new sentencing hearings where they were sentenced to something less than life without parole, and 174 of these were resentenced and released. Of course, there's a larger group that were resentenced and not yet released, but 174 were resentenced and then released. In this 174, 62% had been convicted of first-degree murder, and 28% had been convicted of second-degree murder. In two-thirds of the cases, 64%, like this case, there were multiple defendants. The released lifer had been the primary actor in 82% of the cases. Their age at release averaged 51 years old. The range was from 35 years old to 68 years old. And then they were at large in the community after their release for 21 months, the first 2 years of their time in the community. Now, of course, that's not the rest of their life, but if they're likely to reoffend, it's more likely to happen within the first couple of years. So here's the outcomes of these 174. Only 6 of these defendants, that's 3%, only 6 had been rearrested. Now that doesn't mean reconvicted, that doesn't mean a new violent offense, that doesn't mean they went back to prison, but 6 cases they had been rearrested. The charges were dropped in 4 of those cases. The other 2 had new convictions, one for contempt and another one for robbery third. 174 offenders, released juvenile lifers, released to the community, 1 contempt, 1 robbery third. Now, so on an absolute basis, the risk is extremely low based on this initial follow-up, less than 2%. And then not for terribly serious violent crimes, a robbery third, but not a new homicide or that kind of thing. So what about by contrast? Well, we could look at homicide releasees in general. These are persons that were convicted of homicide and then released to the community after they'd served their sentences. And of those, nationally, 30% are rearrested within 2 years of release. So we've got 3% versus 30% for the folks that committed their homicides as adults. That rate is over 8 times higher.
Dr. Cunningham, what did this study conclude regarding Miller releasees?
So the study concluded that juvenile lifers can be considered low-impact releasees in terms of risk posed to the community.
What other follow-up has there been of offenders resentenced and released pursuant to Miller?
So another group that's been examined is out of Michigan, And there are 142 Miller juvenile lifers who were resentenced and then subsequently released to the community. Of these offenders, only one offender had been rearrested. That's less than 1%. By comparison, the 3-year reincarceration rate, not rearrest, but re-imprisonment, the 3-year reincarceration rate for general parolees in Michigan is 18%, almost 20-fold higher. The comparison 3-year reincarceration rate for offenders paroled from homicide convictions in Michigan is 8%, and that's like 10 times higher for the homicide offenders who were adults as they committed their offenses. So there's another study, quite consistent with that Philadelphia study, that indicates that Miller juvenile lifers pose a very low risk of reoffending in the community and are profoundly disproportionately less likely to be involved in that than general parolees. Kind of the idea, if you're going to parole anybody, these juvenile lifers are the best candidates in terms of low impact on the community.
Dr. Cunningham, do you detail the general parolee base rates in your report?
I do.
What is your conclusion from these base rate data from Miller and general parolee research studies regarding Jeremy's likelihood of success on parole?
That he is likely to be among the most successful releasees.
Dr. Cunningham, is there another domain of factors to consider in doing a parole recidivism analysis?
There is.
What is that domain?
So those are dynamic factors. The ones I've talked about so far are those are kind of immutable. You're a Miller releasee, period. You're an offender of a certain age. You're an offender who has committed a certain crime. You have a certain number of adult arrests, that kind of thing. And so those are kind of fixed by history. There's another set of factors that can't be known yet. Those are dynamic factors. Those are ones that may be present or absent, may develop over time, that influence the likelihood of success on parole. Those dynamic factors, 3 of them involve what quality of kind of general social support programming is available. So that includes a social support system. That's why it's important whether Jeremy's family is still involved with him now, cares about him, and shows indications and promise of being involved with him well into the future. Because a social support system that you're paroled out into is an important factor in your success on parole. Of course, as we sit here today, we don't really know what Jeremy's social support system will consist of at a time that he's ultimately released to the community. We've got some promise about his siblings, but don't know with certainty what's going to happen there with his siblings and his father as well. We don't yet know what relationships he will establish in the community. Some inmates get married across the course of their period of incarceration. We simply don't know, as we sit here today, what that dynamic factor will consist of. Another dynamic factor is housing. Obviously, offenders who have some place to live do better than the guys that are homeless, that don't have access to secure housing. That's linked a little bit to the social support system that you may go out into, as well as what kind of programming exists for parolees that the parole system or different agencies may provide. That housing factor is also unknown at this point, although the family support that he has points to this being there for him. Employment. Parolees who get jobs and are employed do better on parole than those that don't have that involvement in employment. Jeremy has shown early willingness to be employed in his part-time construction work that was well received, but this we also don't know yet what will be in place for him in terms of jobs, what vocational training or additional education he'll complete in custody, or what kind of employment situation he would be paroled out into. And then finally, positive social orientation. Inmates that have a positive community identification, are coping effectively, are trying to live their lives in ways that contribute positively to those around them. Understandably, those inmates end up having more success on parole. Historically, Jeremy has had positive social involvement, before this offense. There are early indications of positive social orientation as he has taken responsibility for his participation in this offense, given a proffer, that sort of thing, made a religious identification with a Christian faith while he's been in custody. So there are early indications of positive social orientation. This, though, is also best informed by who Jeremy is at the time of release, which we can't entirely predict today. That will be obvious to a parole board based on his record and programming and that kind of thing, but it's one that can't be accurately anticipated today with the same certainty and evidence that somebody will have looking at him contemporaneously at that time.
So would it be accurate to say, Dr. Cunningham, that the most accurate determination of the pace of Jeremy's rehabilitation cannot be made today?
That's correct. At this point, we would be forecasting into the future about who he is in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever, 25 years, whatever it is. At that point, it won't be an anticipation of the future. They will have Jeremy's track record. That parole board will have his behavior in custody. They will be able to identify what his track record has been, what his social support system is, what his employment prospects are, how positive his social orientation is. They'll have contemporaneous data about Miller releasees, about general parolees. So there'll be better science and more certain knowledge of who Jeremy has become and what the pace of his rehabilitation was at that time, far superior to what we can forecast today.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you.
Take our mid-morning break right now, 15 minutes.
It was admitted a higher security.
I just didn't want this to create some issue where all of a sudden, you know,
I haven't filed anything.
so those have already been filed, so you don't need to do anything with them. So if you don't need to do anything.
Okay, I'm gonna look here.
Okay. Did you catch that? We didn't file it this week, and
But they filed into the docket, right? Let me look.
So when we filed it, it's fine. I filed it, and it's on it. Because when we filed, we were like, substance abuse evaluation. It's like hospital. So it's filed under the court order evaluation.
It is a higher security level. It's a 2. But those, so, right, so, okay, so I would just make record with the judge about that, that when you e-file them, you need to admit it, right? And then when I go to, when the judge actually physically comes up and change the security level, so they'll come in from close and then I just set the security level. They're gonna have to be as H and I under the exhibit test. Because right now they're just in a court document. So, without. You can file another one, but I have one right here. Yeah, this one might be out of order because I was using it last week at it. Yeah, I mean either way, but yeah, you can definitely have it. If you don't need this when we're done, I would take it back. Is there any comments on that? You have to electronically just upload it with incidents and make a record when you want, where you need to be submitted under seal. Yeah, whatever one, whatever seal or whatever. If it's related like that, and we do this with management, we're probably say that those are individual seal. But as a court order eval with the docket, that's not going to show up on the payroll for this task as H&I. So they're going to be like a separate task in our computer system. No, it's not. But yeah, we could just, it's just a quick little button and change the security level and that will be
we're just trying to make sure
He was just giving me a heads up, Ron, I was doing this, I was just looking at these. So I'm like, yeah, I mean, they don't usually experience, but still. They're usually most of the time. Yeah, that would not quite practice. I don't know if it is.
Oh, that's fine. You ready, Laura? We're back on the record. Council, I heard it through the grapevine that there was some record that maybe council wanted to make regarding exhibits offered yesterday by defense counsel, which was Dr. Cunningham's CV and report. Is that correct, Ms. Jensen?
Yes, that is correct, Your Honor. So we filed Exhibit H and Exhibit I. Exhibit H is Dr. Cunningham's report. We would ask that that be filed at a higher security level than the remainder of the sentencing exhibits.
So you're asking that I be admitted at a higher security level, or both?
I is just the CV, and that's not necessary.
Oh, okay. So just H, higher security level. Any objection from the state?
No, Your Honor. Wait, stand by.
Judge, we have no objection to the request by the defense, and I do have a brief record on a couple of our exhibits from yesterday.
Okay, go ahead.
So we had introduced, let me find it, hang on. Exhibits 124, 125, and 126, which are photos that expose the body of Noema Graber. I was advised that those are not restricted. I would ask that those also receive the same type of security level, given the nature of those photos.
And for the record, Your Honor, I believe that there was a request made in the exhibit list. There's a notation there to request that that be heightened in security.
So security level 1 allows the parties and not the public to view the exhibits. Are we requesting a security level 1 then? It's not, it wouldn't be open to the public, but the
Yes.
attorneys would have.
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I will, and is that what is requested for H as well? Security level 1?
We'll have one other exhibit to add to that as well.
Okay.
I just noticed it's not noted on our exhibit list that the autopsy report should also carry that same security level.
And that's 131?
131, yes.
So by agreement of counsel, I will file security level heightened from 0 to 1 on defense exhibit H, and then states exhibits 124, 125, 126, and 131. Anything else before we begin with cross-examination?
No, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
Go ahead for the state.
Morning, Dr. Cunningham.
Good morning.
Just a couple of quick rehashes of your background here. You're a forensic psychologist,
Clinical and forensic psychologist.
one of 350 board certified in the U.S.
In forensic psychology, there are about 1,200 that are board certified in clinical psychology.
Texan?
Sorry?
You're a Texan?
By birth, yes, and spent most of my life there.
Okay.
How could you tell?
Active duty Navy?
Yes, on internship, and while I was there at the sub-base, so about 4.5 years of active duty and maybe 10 years or more of inactive reserves.
Did you go through like a commissioning program or academy, OCS?
I did not. I actually arrived at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda one morning, got a 30-minute lesson in how to salute, and was sent to the uniform store. So I came on internship at an odd time of the year, did not have the usual military indoctrination.
Never served on subs then?
No, I did not.
Never served on submarines? All right, I'll strike that line of questioning then. You said you worked 240 capital cases.
So I testified at trial in approximately 240 capital cases. I've been involved in at least that many more where I was not called to testify, then have participated in well over 100 capital cases at post-conviction or federal habeas, maybe 60 Atkins cases.
I would presume those are all adult cases?
So I have worked in Miller resentencings and some initial Miller sentencings as well. Those were not death. That first set of numbers I gave you were all death penalty cases. There are many other murder cases that I've worked in, some of them involving youthful offenders who were less than 18. Some were involving youthful offender considerations for offenders who were between the ages of 18 and 22.
Based on the facts of the case we have here, those are the kind of cases I was hoping to ask you about. Ballpark, how many youthful offender or juvenile homicide cases do you think that you've been involved in your career?
Perhaps 30.
Perhaps 30. And in that involvement, who typically hires you?
I was retained by the defense.
In all 30?
Yes.
Okay. And you testified in criminal cases here in Iowa previously?
One instance previously.
Could you tell us about that case?
You know, I don't remember the specifics of it other than it was another Miller case that was here in Iowa, but as I sit here now, I don't recall the name of the defendant.
You remember the county?
I'm sorry, I don't. I travel widely.
You remember the year?
Not specifically. It was about 2017, 2018. It's prior to the pandemic.
You remember where you were staying, the town?
I'm sorry, I don't. I can retrieve that data for you, but I just don't know off the top of my head.
It's fine. What's the hourly rate you're charging for this case?
So my fee is $360 per hour. I've discounted that for travel time. I only charge half rate for travel time. The standard rate is $360.
Could you give us a ballpark on how much you're billing the defense for your involvement in the Goodale case?
I don't have the number. At this point, I have about 125, 130 hours in the case.
Could you do some back of the napkin math on that?
So the total of that fee, if there were 130 hours, would probably be someplace in the neighborhood of $45,000. My approval in this case, the funding approval, was only for 60 hours. The defense may end up paying me for all my hours. It may be that I'm only paid 60 hours, which is what the original approval was for.
Thank you. Running through your PowerPoint here, picked up a couple of, I guess I would call them themes on your presentation. Is it fair to say that one of your themes is that young people are not fully mature by age 18?
That's correct.
When should the law hold somebody fully accountable for their actions?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer with precision. Somebody is accountable for their actions at the point that they are well, I guess even juveniles are accountable for their actions, but they're treated and sentenced under a different system. Miller defendants, even at age 16, are accountable for their actions in that they're going to be convicted and then will face a long-term prison sentence. And so they're being held accountable. In terms of at what point should an individual be sentenced as severely, that's really a function of this individualized sentencing of moral culpability and the specific deterrence those factors would indicate that somebody who's less than 25 is not bringing a fully mature brain apparatus to bear. And so in those terms, that is a consideration that may be brought to bear. For death penalty sentencing purposes, that offense date is at this point 18, although the American Psychological Association has filed amnesty briefs expressing concern with that because brain development is still so incomplete at age 18, and has encouraged reconsideration of that as a matter of public policy. Long answer, I guess I'd say that's kind of above my pay grade, but if we're talking about fully adult brain development, it would be after age 25, with the notion that this is not an either or. There is a steady increase in available resources between the ages of 18 and 25. And so the law may decide to draw a line at 18 or at 22 or at 25 as it gives public policy implication to this research of what resources you have available to you to make your decisions.
But in kind of reading between the lines on the theme I previously asked you about, if young people are not fully mature by 18, then somebody should not be held fully accountable for something that they commit, a crime they commit below 18 compared to above 18. Is that fair?
Well, they should be fully accountable and will be fully accountable. I think an informed sentencing policy acknowledges the resources that somebody brings to their decision making, including this brain development factor. So accountability is like you're found guilty and you face prison time. Then we have a determination of what sentence is attached to that. As that's psychologically informed, that involves that immaturity and other adversities, as well as specific deterrents. The court will have two other issues that it will also incorporate into a sentencing decision that I can't illuminate.
What would those other two be? That would be the retribution and the general deterrence?
That's correct.
Another thing that I picked up on was that young men are generally more violent than old men. Is that fair?
That's fair. And not just young men, teenagers. I don't really consider young men yet. Teenagers, mid-teens forward, are more violent than older men.
Fair enough. Doctor, you produced the slide deck presentation that we've been viewing here the last couple of days, right?
I did.
And did you help with the generation of the questions that were asked by the defense?
I did.
Okay. And when we say help, how much help would you say you provided for the writing of the questions?
Significant. I drafted questions that would elicit the information on each slide as a way of saving for the preparation time of my testimony. Sometimes the defense counsel deviated from that question, but my involvement was significant.
It would be fair to say that in a lot of the questions, you wrote the questions and the answers.
That's correct.
Okay. And I did notice that a couple of these slides looked familiar. You've given this presentation before?
Some aspects of it. The research slides I've used before. The factors that are specific to Jeremy Goodale are original with this case.
So I took the liberty of Googling your name when I found out you were an expert witness on this case and found a number of YouTube videos that were very similar in the structure of their presentation. Are you familiar?
I'm not familiar with my videos. I have not watched those. But I would not be surprised if the organization was quite consistent, which is a marker of good science and sound methodology, that you approach things with similar conceptualizations and it's informed by similar science. So a heart surgeon does a very similar procedure from case to case as he's addressing a particular problem. That's the mark of scientifically informed practice, that there is consistency in methodology and in the underlying conceptualizations.
So your similar conceptualizations would be your, I suppose, your research-informed theories on juvenile brain development and how it applies to criminal activity?
That's right.
and then I presume that you get hired by typically defense attorneys to analyze a juvenile defendant and work that juvenile defendant's facts into your overarching umbrella theory of juvenile brain development and criminality?
That's correct. I would be happy to provide the same evaluation and analysis for your office or other prosecutors, but the phone doesn't ring. This science, I think, is not particularly helpful to what you may be asserting in a sentencing phase.
It's helpful for the defense.
Yes, sir. In this case, the science is more helpful to the defense.
You talked about Jeremy's untreated adult ADHD.
I talked about his untreated ADHD. He was not an adult at that time, but
Okay.
his untreated ADHD.
Was he self-medicating for this?
He was self-medicating with marijuana and other substances for this, in addition to other risk factors impinging on that use.
Heard some interesting testimony about what you described as judgment impulsivity.
Yes.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that is an impulsivity that is not necessarily an instantaneous impulsivity. It's more over a period of time.
That's correct. It's distinguished from reactive impulsivity, which is an immediate response to some stimulus or provocation with very little forethought. Judgment impulsivity may involve planning, but it is planning that is, it's stupid planning. It's planning that neglects potentially pretty obvious consequences and contingencies.
It's pretty fair to state that that's not limited to juvenile criminal defendants. Is that fair?
It's not limited to them. It's much more pervasive among juvenile offenders. It's kind of like saying, so temper tantrums are not limited to a 3-year-old. An adult can have a temper tantrum too. Well, that's right, but they're normative in a 3-year-old, and they're unusual in an adult, and they are driven by different processes.
Well, I think it's fair to state that murder is uncommon in both juveniles and adults, but is it also fair to state that impulsivity is involved in a lot of homicides?
So you asked a compound question. So murder is overrepresented among younger offenders in this age 16 to 23, this period of immature brain development. And so it's overrepresented there. It occurs in persons that are older, but less frequently. That's number one. Number two,
I think my question was uncommon, though. It's not common for juveniles to kill, and it's not common for adults to kill, correct?
that's correct, but that's not a good metric for examining the role of youthfulness in those offenses. The disproportionate risk is our metric, not whether it's broadly uncommon in both.
Okay. Back to the question about judgment impulsivity. You said it does involve some planning, and I think your example was you meet a girl one day, you talk about your future for 2 days, and then you get married on Wednesday,
Yes.
Thursday. How long of a period would you say would require be passed between the idea and the action for it not to fall under the concept of judgment impulsivity?
So it isn't limited to a period of time. The issue there is that you might have, there may be planning over a 3-month period of time that actually represents 10 minutes of planning repeated 50 times.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 young people may plan on running away together and talk and fantasize about that for several months.
Mm-hmm.
But it never proceeds beyond just the euphoric kind of, here's how we're going to get out of the house and down the street. So you can't evaluate judgment impulsivity solely on a metric of time. That said, the more profound the consequences of a decision, the longer period of time is best involved in consideration of that. And as you compress that time against the magnitude of the decision, it increasingly reflects a rush to judgment. It increasingly reflects judgment impulsivity.
Well, in this case, Mr. Goodale and Mr. Miller discussed killing Mrs. Graber 2 weeks prior. It's a little unclear what happened in the intervening 13 days, but approximately 1 day prior to her being killed, they stopped and surveilled her. And then Jeremy waited at the park for Chaden to show up on November 2nd. Is that your understanding of the facts?
Yes.
And it sounds like from what you just previously stated that it's not necessarily their planning that leads to judgment impulsivity, but their lack of follow through on getting away with it, so to speak? What to do after she's dead?
That's not entirely accurate. The essence of a plan is the entirety of the act, and getting away with it. That, much again like our runaways, the issue is not how to get out of the house and down the street. It's how are you going to live after that? What happens to the car? What happens with the police? How are you going to support yourself? What's the longevity of this relationship? It's all these other factors that have not come into the plan. That's what reflects adolescent planning, is it's only up to accomplishing it, and it neglects the long-term contingencies and consequences. That's what's missing from a teenage plan.
Well, Doctor, I think you testified a couple of times here, and I don't think anybody would disagree with you, that the act of the murder is not necessarily the hard part, it's the getting away with it. Is that fair?
That's right.
And Jeremy and Chaden did have some follow-through and some planning on, quote-unquote, getting away with it, right? They moved the vehicle, they brought some devices for disabling her cell phone, they returned to the scene of the crime to hide evidence and dispose of the body. All of those would show follow-through and planning on, quote-unquote, getting away with it, right?
So it's not that there was none at all. It was that it was inadequate. It put them at additional risk, and it required substantial improvisation. So it's not that it just wasn't there at all, but it wasn't there effectively. It wasn't there in a way that would maximize their likelihood of actually getting away with it.
They weren't good at getting away with it, basically.
Well, they were not simply not good at getting away with it. They neglected really thinking through that, and then their operationalizing of their efforts was so poor that they were apprehended within hours.
Agreed. In discussing Mr. Goodale's psychological issues, you bring up Mr. Goodale's father and his vaccine hesitancy for the COVID vaccine. Is that a suggestion that his ideation to kill Mrs. Graber was somehow associated in some way with that?
Well, not simply the opposition to the COVID vaccine. I described a multiplicity of factors impinging on Jeremy's decision-making about participating in this offense. I identified that an aspect of that was his being retarded or delayed in his social identification with the larger community, with his school, with this teacher being a part of his community in a meaningful way.
But that hesitancy was one of the multiplicity of factors?
Well, so as his father has broad and open antagonism and disagreement with all kinds of issues in society, and is openly promoting those to Jeremy, openly holds them in ways that create estrangement with some of his daughters. As he does that, he interferes with Jeremy's identification with that larger community. That now that larger community, those community values and mores are malevolent, they're conspiratorial, they're not to be trusted. You can't really depend on and be a part of that larger community because it's corrupt or misinformed. As that's being promoted to a teenager and to a child, It's interfering with that child's identification with that community and with the development of a reciprocal sense of social obligation. And so that's a piece of a factor that contributes to this. And that's part of what's so disturbing about this. That's the, my God, you killed this teacher who would otherwise seem to be part of a protected class even at your school that you've had, that's a part of your small community where we all trust each other. And so there was a profound delay in Jeremy's identification with the larger community. And then I'm looking at how do we understand that? Where did that come from among these factors that are impinging on him?
Another one of those multiplicity of factors was his mood disorder.
Yes.
And was that impacted by his use of controlled substances, marijuana and alcohol and things along those lines? Is that the mood disorder we're talking about?
Well, the mood disorder is not his substance abuse. The mood disorder is his depression that's accompanied by depressed mood, feelings of futility, loss of interest and motivation, some degree of social withdrawal, passive suicidal ideation, periodic emotional meltdowns, that he has, poor school performance. That's the mood disorder. Now, comorbid with that mood disorder is a substance use disorder. Both of those he has a genetic susceptibility to. Those interact with each other. He is treating his mood disorder with the illicit substances he's taking. That, of course, is a poor treatment modality that further aggravates, exacerbates his life situation, his poor academic achievement, that kind of thing. And so that then potentially increases the depression. It's not an effective self-intervention and is in fact making things worse. But they are not the same thing. They are they're two mutually interacting disorders.
But you talked a little bit about the day of the crime, Mr. Goodale sharing some marijuana with Ms. Pentel.
Yes, for about 45 minutes they were smoking weed.
Almost immediately prior to the act, correct?
That's right.
It's fair to state Jeremy was under the influence when he was involved in the killing of Mrs. Graber.
He was.
But you're not suggesting that this is any kind of defense or excuse to his actions, correct?
No, this is impairment on a continuum. This is not impairment that rises to a level that it causes him not to have a culpable mental state, but as a guilt phase issue.
Because I think you did
does have an impairing effect as a sentencing consideration.
Because you did state that it doesn't impact his ability to know right from wrong, right?
Not as an absolute matter. A 7-year-old knows right from wrong in terms of killing someone. It impairs the quality of his moral reasoning about that.
And diminished moral reasoning, sorry, let me rephrase that. Diminished moral reasoning does not eliminate any knowledge from right or wrong.
Well, that's correct. It doesn't render you stupid, that you just don't know what's going on in the world around you. But it does impact on the way that you relate to that world around you and the reasoning that you bring to bear around the value system. So if he simply didn't know right from wrong, then he would be not guilty by reason of insanity and would not then be accountable for his conduct. Would be excused from it. He would be not guilty. So this doesn't rise to a level, his moral reasoning doesn't rise to that level of being not guilty. It does rise to a sentencing consideration in terms of his not having the moral reasoning resources that an adult would have. It also relates to his long-term rehabilitation potential, because then his moral failures here at age 16, because they're rooted in his immaturity, are not predictive of what moral reasoning he'll bring to bear at 25 or 30 or 35.
And hopefully that will be aided through the rehabilitative process in custody.
Oh yes, it will be aided by the passage of time, and as he participates in positive rehabilitation programming, then it will foster the development of those capabilities.
if you recall slide 97, but I wrote down some questions about the immaturity of planning, operationalizing, and the aftermath of the offense. Do you recall that
I do.
testimony?
I do.
There were 11 factors that you talked about there.
Yes.
And not to generalize too broadly, but don't each of these 11 factors apply to pretty much every homicide defendant regardless of age?
I don't think that they do.
Could you just run through the list of 11?
Sure. So the first one is misguided loyalty. That you agree to participate in a homicide.
And just the list is fine.
Okay, so there's misguided loyalty. That doesn't apply the same. Poor boundaries and limited ego strength. That's different for teenagers. Outsourcing of planning. That's also more typical of teenagers and their law parties deficits. The synergy of immature persons, by definition, involves teenagers, as does the offending much more often involving multiple offenders as opposed to a single offender.
The wisdom of crowds.
Sorry?
The wisdom of crowds.
The wisdom of...
Crowds?
Well, no, sir, it's well...
Well, it's a joke. I mean, a group of people generally make poor decisions.
Particularly groups of young people do. And here we're not simply talking about a group, a crowd, but even the presence of one additional person, or that two teens carry out an act that neither one of them would have done independently. That's very different from adults and the way they approach their offending. A catastrophic response to a transient problem, particularly on this scale. It's difficult to imagine an adult determining to kill their Spanish teacher because they're making a failing grade. The offense itself screams that this is a very immature person making that decision with a catastrophic response to a very transient and minor problem. Impulsivity, particularly the judgment impulsivity here, as it only goes up to the act and really is largely improvisation thereafter. That also is not typical of adults who are not making a decision to kill in the moment, who've decided 2 weeks in advance to carry this out. The rigidity and limited ability to generate alternatives, that also is much more characteristic of youthful offenders as opposed to adults who may even shift gears in the midst of heading a direction in the face of new information. The neglect of risk of apprehension. As adult offenders engage in homicides that were premeditated, much of the effort is directed, perhaps most of the effort is directed toward avoiding apprehension. Improvisation is characteristic of youthful offenders beyond the act itself. Their planning typically only proceeds for 3, 12, 24 hours and doesn't pick up after that. Adults are much more long-term oriented as they look at those issues, and as a result have accounted for more improvisations. The limited theory of mind is characteristic of teenage offenders that don't grasp how this will land. Difficult to comprehend of an adult offender who not only would try to recruit a non-criminal civilian to commit a homicide with them, not a hitman, but a non-criminal peer to participate in a homicide of a known person, and then just goes down the road to recruit somebody else as if that first person isn't going to give evidence against them someday, and then calls several of their friends to fully confess within the first 24 hours in detail, not snapping to the fact that those people are going to end up in a policeman's office. So profound deficits in limited theory of mind that this offense and its aftermath stream about that we wouldn't see at all in an adult offender.
Well, you might apply all those stronger to juveniles. There's a lot of applicability to any kind of murder suspect in these theories, correct?
No, sir. Again, I differentiated as I went through them that these are particularly indicative of a youthful offender and are atypical of an adult offender. That's not to say that there may not be some adult offender out there who picks up a piece or two of these. But I would really challenge you to identify an adult offender who premeditated a murder 2 weeks in advance and exhibits these 11 characteristics. I just don't think that person exists.
Fair enough. Turning to the questions that Mr. Cook asked you about statements to Jackie Goodale on the defendant's lack of remorse.
Yes.
I think you testified that you don't think the defendant understood his own emotions or feelings.
He has limited access to his own emotions and feelings.
Doctor, are you superimposing your own estimate of his feelings for his own recorded statements?
I don't understand the question.
Well, we heard what Jeremy said, and you're telling us that you don't think that he meant what he said?
Well, I guess I would quote Henry David Thoreau, who says, "It doesn't matter what you look at, it matters what you see." To simply take Jeremy's statement at age 16, within 48 hours after this offense, with his limitations, and somehow treat that as being the same as if it was said by somebody who is 30. You're looking at it, but you're not seeing it. Because if you see it, then you see the context that this is in and what else is going on.
But he said what he said, didn't he?
Well, sure. So I've never disputed he said it. The issue is, what implications does it have that he said it? And most importantly, does this reflect someone who is irreparably corrupt, who is incapable of remorse and recognition of how they've injured others? So we're really talking about of what diagnostic significance is that statement.
And I don't think anybody up here has said that Jeremy's irreparably corrupt. I'm pretty sure.
Well, that's the implication that by seizing on that as beyond just a statement by an immature kid in the moment, who still as immature as he was 24 hours before. To emphasize that is to implicitly give it some sort of larger diagnostic significance.
It's been a fair amount of talk about Jeremy Goodale's home life. Jeremy had a relatively large family, correct?
Yes, sir, my current standards, not as I was growing up, but my current standards. You know, to have 5 kids is a big family.
Had a family who loved him, more or less?
I'm sorry?
His family loved him?
Yeah, I can't answer. It's hard to answer yes or no. So love is not either present or absent. Love is on a continuum.
Okay,
It's like IQ.
They're here today, a lot of them, right?
Sure, they love him as best they can through their limitations. They care about him. The love that they had for him was not expressed in functional ways that would optimize his best outcome. They loved him badly in many respects.
Okay. Jeremy always had a roof over his head. He wasn't homeless.
That's right.
Jeremy wasn't food insecure.
That's right.
Jeremy went to a private school for much of his life.
That's right. On scholarship for a part of it. Yes, he was in a private school.
Maybe Jeremy's home life wasn't perfect, but I would presume you've seen far worse upbringings and home lives in your profession.
I've seen different presentations of deprivation. I have not seen a lot of cases where autonomy was undermined in early childhood to the degree that was here. I have not seen very many cases where your mama abandoned you at age 10. So there are features of this that are very pathological. There are other aspects of it where it wasn't as if he was beaten. He was not sexually abused by his family members. There are things that I've seen that were not in this case, but there are things that are here that were destructive in their own way.
Doctor, are you uncomfortable stating that in your 500 criminal cases that you've been involved with, that you haven't objectively seen worse home lives than Jeremy Goodale's?
I'm saying that the effect of somebody's home life isn't easy to reduce into better or worse. I've seen home lives that were characterized by greater maltreatment. and greater deprivations of some sorts. This home life, along with the other risk factors, was enough to get us here. And that's always what's happened in these murder cases. Whatever the background is, ultimately, this is where it ended.
Dr. Jeremy Goodale's home life does not explain his murder of Mrs. Graber, does it?
I think it's an important part of the explanation. It didn't make it happen, but it is part of the trajectory that put him at risk and does significantly explain his participation. I guess conversely, if it doesn't, then what does? If his home life, his ADHD, his substance abuse, his mood disorder, if those don't explain why he agreed to Chaden's request that he help him kill Ms. Graber, then what does? What are we suggesting did that? That he is inherently an evil person? That he's just a bad seed? That's kind of what we're left with if these other factors don't explain how we got here.
Well, doctor, if you're saying that it does explain the murder of Mrs. Graber, I hope you're not suggesting that it excuses it.
I'm not saying it excused it. I'm not saying it absolutely caused it. I'm saying these factors inclined the angle of the choice that Jeremy had and correspondingly reduced his moral culpability.
Fair enough. There's a lot of testimony about the pandemic and the effects on Jeremy. He went to school online, right?
So there was a little testimony about the pandemic. There was a slide or two about that. He did go to school. He was at the Maharishi School. They went online in early 2020, and he was subsequently online.
And there was a lack of supervision during his online schooling.
That's right.
And there was some tension with his father's expectations of his schooling.
Oh, there was more than simply tension. Dean was expecting that he structure himself to be able to do this. Jeremy, by age and ADHD, simply did not have that capacity. As he's not structuring himself and Dean ramps up the pressure, their relationship deteriorates. And there's more conflict and more meltdowns.
The educational aspects of the COVID pandemic were in no way unique to Jeremy, correct?
That's correct. His experience of it may be unique,
Sure.
but the context itself, it wasn't just Jeremy who was sent home. All the kids were online.
All the kids were online. All the kids were isolated. There were probably tensions in the home. This is certainly not a unique circumstance to Jeremy, right?
His experience of it, I think, was more unique based on his own vulnerabilities and family structure and that kind of thing. This was a developmental disruption for all the kids involved. That was not for free. That has ended up with repercussions in their lives. So there's concern about the reverberating mental health and educational and social impacts that happened as a result of keeping kids at home during the pandemic. And so it may have been necessary from a public health standpoint, but it was not an intervention that was for free. There are casualties that have come out of that.
But kind of like with Jeremy's home life, keeping Jeremy at home during the pandemic does not explain his decision to murder his teacher.
It's a factor that contributed to the trajectory that led him there. That's why I testified about it, because it diminished and disrupted the resources that he could bring to his decision-making, and in that way is part of that explanation.
Doctor, would you say that the effect of the pandemic on Jeremy's education in any way excuses his decision to kill the teacher?
Well, no, sir, none of this is an excuse. We're past that. He's pled guilty. And so we're beyond excuses. That's a guilt phase issue. Now we're talking about what resources he can bring to bear. And when you set it up as an excuse, it's as if we're back at the guilt phase. We're past that. No longer excuse. Now, based on what resources he had available to him, what's the appropriate sentence? We're not in the excuse zone anymore. Now, it isn't the disruptive effect that it had on his education that I'm concerned about. It's the disruptive effect that it had on his psychology and on his relationships. That was the damaging part of the pandemic, not that he fell behind in his schoolwork.
And Doctor, we've talked about irreparable corruption and that Jeremy is not irreparably corrupt. Would you describe irreparable corruption?
So that would be someone whose criminal and criminally violent proclivity is a function of their character and personality that has become fixed in them. From whatever cause, it's like concrete that's no longer wet and is hardened. Well, now because that's hardened, there is an enduring specific deterrence problem. You may still have mitigation in that they didn't choose to have that character. This is a character that was developed as a result of deprivations and damage, so the mitigation, the moral culpability piece is still there, but because it's now hardened, we have an enduring specific deterrence problem about letting them out. That's where this Miller defendant data is so helpful as we look at these adolescent murderers who, by their conduct in the community, demonstrate that the concrete was not hardened back here as teenagers.
So an irreparable corrupt individual would need to be warehoused as a public safety concern, correct?
Yes.
And Jeremy is not irreparably corrupt
That's
based on.
not by my judgment.
But does that not take into account the present state of the law in Iowa? Jeremy Goodale cannot be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, correct?
That's right.
So the state of the Iowa law as it exists today takes into account the fact that somebody who commits a homicide before they turn 18 cannot be legally irreparably corrupt.
Well, the life without parole issue is not simply about being irreparably corrupt. It's also about the limited resources that adolescents could bring to their decision making that would say that the needs of justice have been are not properly addressed if if the mitigating effect is not recognized. Irreparably corrupt from a specific deterrent standpoint would say that this person needs to be quarantined as long as possible. Might not be life without parole, but it would be long term.
But in reviewing your report and your testimony in court here in the last couple of days, it appears that the thrust of your argument is that Jeremy should not be warehoused away, that he is not irreparably corrupt and that he has a chance of rehabilitation at some point in the future. Correct?
That half of my testimony, yes, the other part of it talks about the resources that he brought to his decision making.
But that's completely consistent with the state of the law as it is today, right?
I don't think my testimony is contrary to the law as it exists today. It's trying to illuminate the application of that law.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cunningham, just a few follow-up questions. You were asked a question about being retained by defense counsel. If the science that you are so obviously qualified to testify about were helpful to the state, would you be willing to testify for the state?
Well, certainly. I don't base my involvement in a case on whether I'm contacted by the state or the defense, and I do the same evaluation regardless of who calls me, and then would present it in the same way. I understand why the state has not retained me in this case to do this same evaluation and present this same testimony. Because this science is not helpful to what the state is typically asserting at either capital sentencing or at youthful sentencing. And that assertion is typically one that would emphasize the volitional choice of the defendant that is made out of what we might characterize as an evil heart, that's how we got here. And so that means that he needs to be maximally punished because of that volition, and he needs to be incarcerated indefinitely because of that inherently evil heart that is, of course, an immutable condition. Now, the science of psychology, by contrast, is that the involvement in criminal violence and in murder, and particularly for youthful murderers, is not simply the wholly volitional product of a malignantly evil heart, but is instead decisions that are made out of the limited apparatus of a juvenile brain that may be particularly immature in its functional maturity based on the deprivations and adversities that have happened, often augmented by mood disorder or substance dependence, that in an environment or in a social interaction that youth doesn't have the capabilities and the ego strength to extricate himself from. And that out of that, it's not that he's not guilty, it's not that he's not held accountable, but that those vulnerabilities and the prospect for having a meaningful, contributing, constructive life in the community are such that should be taken into consideration at sentencing. So I'm like a researcher that studied the relationship between cigarette smoking and cancer and found there to be a relationship. I'll never be called by the tobacco companies. Not because I have a bias, but because that's just the nature of the science.
You were also asked questions about your hourly rate, and I think, just so the court is clear on this, Dr. Cunningham, and you did address this, your estimate when I originally contacted you was substantially less than the time that you ultimately expended in this case, correct?
That's correct. The efforts and time that I exert to a case, I base on what I regard as the requirements of the case and my own internal standard of excellence. If I get approval for that time, that's good. I like that best. If that approval is not extended beyond what was originally estimated, then that's simply something I've donated to this court.
And in this particular case, you've expressed your willingness to do that, correct?
That's correct. In my communications to you, I've described, here's my time involvement. You guys let me know what you want to do.
And I think the implication of those questions essentially is that the defense paid for a favorable opinion from you. Is that accurate?
Typically, as the money is brought up, that's when there's nothing else to really discredit me about. So if you can't do anything else, then talk about the money. And so that's kind of that's how the cross-examination may work.
And in fact, as I know we have discussed this and it's part of your CV, you've received awards and commendations from judges that you've worked in front of. Is that correct?
So I've had letters of recommendations from judges that I've testified in front of that have been submitted in support of some of the national recognition that I've received.
These weren't defense attorney judges, right? These judges are neutral arbitrators of what's happening, correct?
That's correct. Who I testified in front of and found that testimony to be worthy of some additional attention.
Now, to address a couple other topics here, is it accurate to say that the underlying principles, the science, would be the same in every juvenile case, and as indicated by your statement that a lot of the slides that you've used in your presentation here over the last 2 days are duplicative of other juvenile cases that you worked on?
That's correct. The slides that address the science are duplicative, and the slides that address broad concepts are duplicative. The case-specific slides are specific and were created in response to what I observed in Jeremy Goodale's childhood and family and community experience. As
an expert, as a board-certified clinical and forensic psychologist, these are all science-based opinions that you've been able to provide with hard data to support your opinions. Is that correct?
Well, so the science is the foundation for it. That tells me what to pay attention to and what meaning it has. then I take that science and my clinical experience as I gather data and do an evaluation in a particular case. That data is then informed by the scientific methodology that's brought to bear and by the scientific research that attaches what meaning it has, that answers the so what question. So what he was depressed. What does a mood disorder have with violence in the teenage years? Okay, it's the science, it's the studies that give meaning to that. So I'm taking a clinical history about mood disorder, and then I'm looking to the science to identify what meaning and import does that have.
And because you're a forensic psychologist, you would certainly be aware that the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, particularly Miller, that is the basis for this change in direction as how we treat juvenile offenders, particularly in murder cases. The driving force there is the science, correct?
Well, that's exactly right. The Miller decision heavily cites to the Amici brief, the friend of the court brief, filed by the American Psychological Association, as well as other scientific organizations that detail these changes in brain development that I testify about. And it's that integration of science into public policy that resulted in this kind of sentencing proceeding about how a juvenile murderer is sentenced, is out of recognition of these limitations of youth.
You had discussed Doctor, during your discussion of judgment impulsivity, you discussed, and you've discussed throughout the course of the last 2 days, how there's basically good planning and bad planning, and it could depend on, you're looking at those factors to determine if this was a impulsive judgment on that person's part. And you discussed whether or not there are weeks of planning or months of planning. I believe you said it in this case before, but as it applies to Jeremy's case, what were your observations of the planning in this case?
That it was outsourced, that it was primitive, that it extended only as far as accomplishing the murder, largely with problematic to catastrophic improvisation after that.
Would you describe this as weeks of planning?
I would describe this as minutes of planning repeated over a 2-week period.
Would it be accurate to say that no one thing led Jeremy to make the decision to get involved in this horrific crime?
Oh, yeah, that's fair. I mean, obviously the seminal event is Chaden's request. Chaden doesn't request him to assist. Jeremy has now graduated from high school. None of this happened. So that's the pivotal event that happened. None of the formative factors alone determined his agreement and subsequent participation.
And despite the state's cross-examination and your answers in response, would it still be your position that the Board of Parole, at the time they make that decision, would be in the best position to make a determination as to Jeremy's rehabilitation?
That's correct.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
No recross, Your Honor.
Thank you, Dr. Cunningham. You can step down.
Thank you, sir.
Further evidence from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
So then, counsel, I was going to have the state give their recommendation on sentence, then have defense counsel give their recommendation on sentence, then Mr. Goodale would have the opportunity to make a statement if he chose to before sentencing, and then there would be victim impact statements. Are we all on the same page there?
Your Honor, I've consulted with defense counsel previously, and the state has no resistance. I think they were wanting to have Mr. Goodale make a statement prior to the arguments of both state and defense.
That is correct, Your Honor.
Is that, are we ready to do
As
that?
long as victim impact statements are last, which is where they should be, that's will remain in that order.
That's correct, Your Honor.
Okay, so at this time, Mr. Goodale, you have the right of allocution. Do you wish to make a statement before I sentence you?
Your Honor, before he begins, I would request permission to reorient his chair so he can face the Graber family.
Go ahead. The only, just so Laura can hear him, so I don't know if we need to put a mic on him. Yeah.
I think they're going to mic me in. I want to say I'm grateful for this chance to speak my piece. I offer my sincerest apologies to the Graber family, but I know my words will never be enough. I've had time to think on what to say, and I'm sorry, truly sorry. What I've taken can never be replaced. Every day I wish I could go back and stop myself, prevent this loss and this pain that I've caused everyone. Everyone in the community and outside of it, those closest to me and those closest to the Graber family, as well as the Graber family. I didn't know how taking Miss Graber's life would affect you. I can't comprehend losing a loved one in such an awful way. I'm sorry I didn't stop this from happening in the first place. I'm understanding now that Miss Graber meant so much to so many people. She was a support to the community and those close to her. And she was a caregiver to her family, to her children, and to her own husband. I'm so sorry. To Mrs. Graber's friends and the members of her church, I'm truly sorry for what I've taken from you. I never stopped to consider the community. To everyone at Fairfield High School who felt unsafe, those who were scared, those who lost hope, I'm sorry for what I've done. I'm sorry how my actions have affected you. I owe an apology to all my friends. I'm sorry for the stigma placed on you just for having known me. Zach, Habib, Zoe, and John, I didn't care. I didn't even know what this had done to you. And I'm sorry. And Dad, I'm sorry that I let you down in so many ways. Jackie and Sophia, you've given so much to me. I'm supposed to be helping you and Dominic right now, Jackie, but I can't. Instead, I've caused so much stress, and so much loss, and so much grief. And to all of my siblings, I took your little brother. And Dad, I took your son from you. 2 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life, and I take full responsibility for what I did. And today, as a young man, I can begin to pay for that. I can never give back what I've taken. But I hope that this situation doesn't end as tragically as it began, and that someday something positive can come from this tragedy. I know that my words will never be enough, but to Miss Graber and all her family, I'm truly sorry. Thank you.
Does the state want to be heard on sentence?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, it's important to keep in mind how we got here today. As Jeremy detailed in his Snapchat messages, the last thing she ever saw was Jeremy's face. She was walking in the park on November 2nd, 2021. She was coming up the hill. Jeremy was wearing a mask, shock of blonde hair coming down. He was walking towards her. She got frightened. She got scared. And he took down his mask to reassure her. And he smiled. She smiled back. And he was looking at her in the eyes when Chaden Miller walked up behind her wearing yellow gloves and a baseball bat and took her life. Jeremy was the last face that she saw. He then aided Chaden in dragging her into the woods and hit her in the head 5 times, ending her life. Jeremy acted in consort with the co-defendant in this case, and the state's recommendation is based on a lot of factors. 902.1 sub 2, sub B, sub 2, sub A details a number of factors that the court needs to keep in mind when considering the appropriate and effective judgment and sentence to pass down for this crime. Subsection A indicates the court needs to consider the impacts of this offense on each victim. Well, Your Honor, the victim is dead. The impact cannot be more grave. And on the people she's left behind, the impact will be heard by the court shortly. But it's fair to state that the death of Noema Graber has fundamentally changed the nature and structure of this family. Sub B indicates the court needs to consider the impact of the offense on the community. This offense has had a substantial and lasting impact, as testified to by Lieutenant Kinsella. Subsection C indicates that the threat and safety of the public needs to be considered by this court. The defendant had no motive in this case. His motive was to assist in Chaden Miller. It was Chaden's motive. Jeremy was along, in his words, quote, because he didn't want to seem like a pussy, end quote. That lack of motive could cut a couple of ways, but frankly, increases the threat.
I think we might need to take a break here for a second. The defendant's got a bloody nose.
Oh, sorry.
No, you are fine. We'll, let's take a break and see if we can get that taken care of. We're off the record. Do you want to go to lunch now, or do you want to keep going?
I'm fine to go to lunch. I think it's probably,
Your Honor, my argument would be substantial. We need to go to lunch first.
Okay.
how's
We
the
have
substantial?
10 that can impact statements also, just keep that in mind.
So let's come back at 12:45 then? All right, we'll be in recess.
That